Designed to penetrate deep into the most hotly contested airspace on the planet, Northrop Grumman's B-21 Raider builds upon the low observable legacy of its predecessor, the now legendary B-2 Spirit, while offering a big boost in stealth, onboard computing power, sensors, avionics, and more. Now, this new bomber, it might be fair to say, was designed specifically with Chinese targets in mind, as the Air Force recognizes China as America's pacing threat. And that means this aircraft's worst day needs to be China's best. Of course, assessing China's best can be pretty tough to do at times, though, because the nation maintains strict censorship over its entire media apparatus, with the ruling regime dictating talking points to the nation's journalists to ensure positive framing for China's Communist Party and negative framing for just about everybody else. But looking at what the Chinese government tells its media to say about the B-21 can be a pretty interesting exercise in itself. So let's talk about the Chinese media's response to America's new stealth bomber and try to determine what these CCP-approved talking points are actually getting at once you read between the lines. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Here in the United States, we have a deeply imperfect media apparatus that, while usually free from direct government interference, is, more often than not, subject to the whims of massive corporations and billionaire moguls. Our profit-driven model of journalism has slowly chipped away at editorial budgets while incentivizing hot takes and controversy over substance, because, well, substance is time-consuming and expensive, while shallow performative opinions offer a much higher financial return. But here in the States, we also have a bad habit of assuming our problems are the worst problems. And while the competing financial interests that drive our media machine may indeed be immensely problematic, that competition has, nonetheless, created a breadth of perspectives. Every political or ideological group now has a media and accompanying subculture all its own. And while these media companies and even individual creators remain broadly motivated by profit, those different viewpoints still spark conflict across groups, shaping national discourse around debate that, at least sometimes, can even be productive. But that isn't how the media works in every country. In contrast to America's diverse array of competing news narratives, Chinese news media is almost entirely absent of opposing viewpoints, with the nation's largest news outlets deriving their coverage directly from the guidance of state censors, lest they suffer legal reprisals or worse. In fact, as of January 2025, a full half of all journalists currently jailed on this planet are all wasting away in Chinese prison cells, making China the world's most prolific jailer of journalists by a pretty wide margin. Or, as the Council on Foreign Relations put it in their 2017 report, Media Censorship in China, modern China now boasts one of the world's most restrictive media environments. And in 2016, Chinese President Xi Jinping went ahead and just said the quiet part out loud as he toured the nation's top 3 state-run media outlets and addressed the people working there. I'll quote the Chinese president now. "The media, run by the party and the government, are the propaganda fronts and must have the party as their family name. All the work by the party's media must reflect the party's will, safeguard the party's authority, and safeguard the party's unity. They must love the party, protect the party, and closely align themselves with party leadership in thought, politics, and action." And while many Americans have recently begun turning to individual social media creators that they've grown to trust as their confidence in traditional news outlets has waned, that isn't really an option for Chinese citizens either. China's efforts to control discourse within its borders have grown right alongside the number of users taking to social media. This time, I'll quote a group of Harvard researchers from their peer-reviewed paper entitled "Reverse Engineering Censorship in China." The Chinese government has built a massive social media censorship organization, the result of which constitutes the largest selective suppression of human communication in the recorded history of any country. And these sentiments were also echoed by a cybersecurity research group from the University of Toronto called Citizen Lab, who studied 8 major Chinese search and social media platforms throughout 2023. They found more than 66,000 algorithmic censorship rules in place across the breadth of Chinese search and social media websites, barring everything from pictures of Winnie the Pooh to mentions of international warrants for Vladimir Putin's arrest. To put it plainly, the Communist Party of China understands the importance of controlling the narrative, of framing foreign developments and world events in a way that keeps its massive population compliant and largely unbothered by their lack of direct influence over the ruling body of the nation. The things that conspiracy theorists are always claiming are true about the American media objectively are true about China's state-run media apparatus. And because this isn't my first day on the internet, I know that I needed to spell that out for some folks plainly, because they'll be so angry at me suggesting that maybe America isn't the worst at anything, that they're probably still down in the comments calling me, well, either a fascist or a communist, depending on their political affiliation and their ability to spell. But kidding aside, the real reason I wanted to highlight how homogenous Chinese media coverage is, by design, is to provide the appropriate framing for our exploration into Chinese media coverage of America's new stealth bomber, the B-21 Raider. Because there are several points about this platform echoed again and again across, well, pretty much all media discussions about this bomber in China. And knowing what we do about the source of these shared talking points, we can assess that these are either the things that the Chinese government really believes, or they're the things they want their people to. And that might be able to provide us with some insight into how the CCP perceives the threat posed by this new bomber. And to make sure I'm not just relying on Google Translate for this, I'm also going to lean on the work of U.S. Air Force China Aerospace Studies Institute senior researcher Derek Solen, and his 2023 report entitled PLA hopes B-21 will follow in B-2's footsteps. As Solen points out in his analysis, the overarching theme of B-21 coverage throughout all of China in the months following its unveiling was to significantly downplay the effect this new aircraft might have on the balance of power between American and Chinese militaries. And that pretty much mirrors exactly what I found in my own research. But while Solen objectively states that there's really no way to know if this trend reflects an actual consensus within the Chinese military or a good old-fashioned state-run propaganda effort, my own research has swayed me toward the latter. You see, despite some dismissive takes about the aircraft itself, it seems as though much of China's B-21 bashing is centered around the idea that the United States just won't have enough money to build more than 100 of these bombers, which isn't necessarily an unfounded take, but also insinuates that these bombers could indeed be a real problem if Uncle Sam manages to keep his checkbook in order. Now, the first really in-depth Chinese coverage of the B-21 came just 6 days after its unveiling in the global military section of the Liberation Army News, an outlet overseen directly by China's Communist Party's Central Military Commission. The article was penned by 3 researchers out of the People's Liberation Army Air Force Research Institute and presented the aircraft's tentative specs just as they were relayed by Northrop Grumman, while calling it a, quote, strategic gamble to assume those specs would hold true. And while they did acknowledge that the B-21 could enhance America's, quote, offensive superiority while forcing adversaries to funnel resources into finding ways to counter its improved stealth, they also described their estimate of the overall bomber's cost as astonishing. As they see it, the B-21 program is so pricey that the B-21 will have difficulty achieving any strategic effect. The team closed their analysis by positing that some country could also achieve a breakthrough in strategic technology someday that could offset America's B-21 strategy, which is, ironically enough, a tentative acknowledgement that stealth aircraft still pose a real threat to Chinese targets, which is something we'll see is consistently discounted in further coverage. That same day, a similar article was published in a major newspaper run by the Chinese Communist Youth League called the China Youth Daily. And the article was penned by a group of researchers out of China's Northwestern Polytechnical University. This analysis was more direct in highlighting the B-21's improved stealth and sensor networking capabilities before pivoting to a long list of seemingly unsubstantiated shortcomings, saying the bomber's maximum takeoff weight is, quote, relatively small, which will result in a short combat radius, making the bomber highly reliant on tankers. And this idea that the B-21 will lack the range needed to be useful in a fight was also a favorite among Chinese television pundits as well. In my research, I was able to find at least one recorded television segment from December of 2022 in which a China Central television presenter claimed the B-21 had the shortest combat radius of any American bomber and was, as a result, inferior to the older B-2. That idea that the new B-21 is somehow worse than the older B-2 was also a very common point across the print and television coverage I was able to find. Now, the B-21's unrefueled range has yet to be officially disclosed, but Chinese media is right that the bomber is expected to be smaller than the B-2 it replaces. However, according to Northrop Grumman CEO Kathy Warden, the Raider actually offers greater range than the B-2, which can cover a whopping 6,900 miles between fill-ups. So it's not really clear where this idea is coming from. Now, that Chinese article goes on to refer to China's, quote, relatively perfect counter-stealth sensor network and air defense system that they say the B-21 would still struggle to penetrate despite its improved stealth. And finally, they closed by treading those same points about the bomber being too expensive to produce in real numbers, which they poetically refer to as walking in the trail of the B-2. A later analysis published in the Chinese National Defense News, a sister publication to the aforementioned Liberation Army News, seems to offer the latest and most cohesive B-21 narrative that's become the standard across Chinese media since. Unlike that initial coverage, this and similar articles to date no longer relay the B-21's reported specifications, opting instead to focus on reasons why the bomber will fail to meet expectations. In particular, they call out Northrop Grumman's decision to label the B-21 as a sixth-generation aircraft as an apparent sign of the Air Force's, quote, lack of confidence in the bomber itself. Now, in the past, I have also called that sixth-generation moniker a bunch of marketing nonsense, but Chinese analysts instead call it propaganda used to justify, you guessed it, what they consider to be the immense and unsustainable cost of the B-21 program. Again, just saying it's too expensive to build. And like many other Chinese defense outlets I reviewed, this article's author also claimed that stealth is no longer valuable, as, quote, many radars have the capability to detect stealth targets. Now, defeating stealth is such a common facet of Chinese media reporting that there are near-weekly announcements about new ways they can detect or target the F-22 from space or hit the B-21 with hypersonic missiles and the like. But oddly enough, despite these constant reports of stealth's demise, those articles never seem to broach the topic of China's massive and continued investment into developing stealth airframes of their own, with at least 5 ongoing and publicly disclosed stealth fighter or bomber programs continuing to mature under Chinese banners, alongside these parallel claims that stealth's value has been significantly diminished. But of course, this analysis and just about every other article I managed to translate eventually hangs its hat on that same point about the B-21 just being too expensive and America's inability to see expensive programs like this to fruition. And the truth is, it's not exactly unfounded to criticize America's habit of cutting expensive aircraft programs short and curtailing their strategic impact. There was, of course, a time when the United States meant to purchase some 132 B-2 Spirits rather than the 21 that were ultimately built. Likewise, the F-22 Raptor's production run was originally set at 750 fighters before being slashed to 648 and then 442, 381, and finally just having 187 jets built. And to be clear, it is entirely possible that the B-21 could suffer a similar fate, just as Chinese analysts suggest. But it's also important to consider the historical context of those past cuts. Both the B-2 and F-22, like other immensely expensive programs like the Seawolf class of submarines, all saw their contracts awarded at a time of direct military competition with a global superpower. When that superpower, the Soviet Union, collapsed in 1991, the US began rolling these programs back in search of what we called at the time a peace dividend, until in 2001, America's defense priorities shifted dramatically, and these same near-peer programs were cut further to fund combat operations in the Middle East. That is to say that these Cold War-era programs came to a close alongside the Cold War they were built for. The F-35, on the other hand, emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union, and has since seen more than 1,100 airframes built for the United States and its allies, despite a very troubled and very pricey acquisition cycle. So if we were to use these past programs as our model, the way these Chinese analysts purport to be doing, that would suggest B-21 production could indeed be cut short if the ruling Communist Party of China were to collapse. Of course, cuts can still happen. They're just far from certain at this stage. Solen's paper does highlight one place in these heavily censored publications where you can still find pretty objective discussions about foreign military technology, if only for purely practical reasons. The science and technology section of that same Chinese National Defense News that we discussed earlier. You see, as Solen explains, this section often eschews CCP talking points for the sake of introducing foreign technology to the defense community at large so that it can either be adopted or at least effectively countered. In this section, B-21 coverage is decidedly more glowing, with the author clearly not downplaying the bomber's strategic value and even refuting the popular Chinese claim that it'll offer shorter ranges than previous bombers. And while the rest of the Chinese media really hammered on the idea that America can't afford to build this new bomber, this standout article paints a completely contradictory picture, saying that, quote, affordability is the B-21's major advantage, and that it will allow the United States to acquire, maintain, and operate these bombers at large scale. And in one last significant contradiction to the rest of the party line, this article closes by stating, and I quote, "This aircraft is absolutely not a simplified version of the B-2, so we cannot treat it lightly." Now, Solen closes his own analysis by considering the importance of this unique perspective and the possibility that it might reflect much more than a single oppositional voice. I'll quote Solen now. "The Chinese media's analysis of foreign countries and their armed forces is unabashedly subjective, and the global military and international sections of the PLA's two main newspapers always downplay the efforts of Beijing's enemies. Writing for a different section with a less ideological purpose, Zinn, the author, was unburdened by the requirement to weave a political message into his analysis. So it is perhaps more likely that the view that he expressed is closer to the prevalent opinion in the PLA. So, while China's media censorship allows them to maintain the decisive advantage in the domestic headline war, it seems China's military may not be certain about their ability to win in the real thing. And regardless of which Chinese news outlet you prefer, one thing is clear across pretty much all of them. China seriously does not want to see the B-21 Raider produced in significant numbers. And in the end, maybe that tells us everything that we need to know. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe below. and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.